Hit it.
Hello, my name is Ralph Hopkin. I'm an old fart. I was born in 1930 in the United Kingdom, and I'm being told that this is going to be my story, so I've got to remember what lies I tell.
Okay, on the show today we have Ralph with us. Ralph, tell us about the first time you heard the bombers overhead and bombing going on.
Oddly enough, that's one of my more vivid recollections because kids collect things nowadays. Well, nobody had any money back then, and what we used to collect were hat badges from the different regiments and other, decorations and stuff. But also bomb fragments that were left over. And I remember this was the first bomb fragment that I was able to pick up. And it was not a big air raid. I don't know, it was a nighttime raid. And I can't remember if we had an air raid shelter at the time or not. We did later on, but I can't remember if we had an air raid shelter. I'll talk about those in a minute. I don't remember the sirens going. I just remember the bombs start falling, and at the bottom of the road was a gas station. They hit that, and over.
Could you hear the bombs falling from the plane? Did they make a noise?
Yeah, we could hear the bombs coming. We could hear the planes. They whistle on the way down. Well, those did. I don't know if everybody's did. It is an interesting aside. I was talking about souvenirs. The German incendiary bombs at the time were about smaller in diameter than a Coke can, flat-ended, and they had fins on the back end with a ring, and they were quite nice. And they wouldn't burn. Everything else would burn. And people used to collect them afterwards, clean them up, and paint them, turn them upside down and make little vases out of them. They're probably collector's items now, but we had a couple of them, put flowers in them and remember where they came from.
Tell me about the gas station that got blown up the first night.
Well, it's nothing. First of all, it was in a different country. It was in Britain, and it was, generally speaking, poorer. It's always been a little bit poorer than the United States on per capita, but the gas stations then, there was no forecourt. You pulled up, you stayed on the road, and of course you're on the wrong side, you're on the left, and they had a big arm that swung out over the sidewalk, and the hose angled down, and there was a window in the pole, and it went round and round and round, so you knew there was gas coming, and then it would register on the thing. And when it was all done, you didn't pump your own gas, by the way. Oh, God forbid. The gas jockey had to do it for you, but it was over the sidewalk. It was weird looking back, but that's what they did.
How much was fuel?
I have no idea. No idea whatsoever. We never owned a car. We never owned much of anything.
Tell me about your childhood. How old were you during this time?
During this time?
Yeah, 1939.
Yeah, I was 9 years old, and I was 16 when the war finally ended. 15, almost 16, yeah. So I went from childhood to youthhood. Oh, yeah, this might be worth looking at. My first real memory of anything that flew was during the Depression. We were basically homeless, and we lived at my uncle's place, and he had pots of money, ended up as the mayor of Southampton, so he must have been on the take somewhere. But anyway, I was in the orchard, and I heard this weird noise, and I looked up, and this gigantic silvery shape appeared. And I have no idea, like 4 years old maybe, and I saw this thing, didn't know what it was, and it wasn't until fairly recently I got to wondering, well, what was it that I really saw? It was either the R-101 or the R-100 or the Graf Zeppelin. I was able to eliminate the R-100 and the R-101, but the Graf Zeppelin was cruising around England at that time, ostensibly on a goodwill tour, but a rumor had it, and the rumor of the day was that they were doing what they called preparation for the Baedeker raids. And the Baedeker was a German tourist guidebook. It did all the towns in England, principal features and so forth and so on. And the Graf Zeppelin flew over most of these places, and everybody thought, wow, they're picking out targets for the war. Well, I don't know if they did or not, but some pretty weird places did get bombed. When you hear about the bombing, you hear about the big cities and not the other stuff. So, but I was lucky. I had very, very good parents, very ethical, very honest. Didn't have two pennies to rub together. Dad was unskilled in the sense that he didn't have a profession or a trade, but he knew a lot of stuff. And he was a tailor in India before he married my mother. And he was there in the days of the Raj, when Britain ruled India. And I got some old photographs of him somewhere. He came back to England at the outbreak of World War I to join the army, and he ended up in the military. He was on the Western Front, and he was on he was a dispatch rider back in that day. So he must have been behind the lines quite a bit, because he rode he could never exactly tell me what motorcycle it was. He called it a 2.5 Douglas. So he looked up all kind of Douglases. I think I know what bike it was. Of course, it was all belt driven and weird looking. But anyway, he was a dispatch rider, and then came home and lots of unemployment, and he worked at whatever he could find. So,
what was it like, the prelude to the war and the talk?
World War II?
Yeah, of World War II. Because I know you were 9 years old, so you probably didn't hear a lot.
I did actually hear a great deal, because we had there was no TV. The things that you take for granted today didn't exist. There was no TV at all in Britain, and there was baby TV in the United States at that time, just getting going. So we had a radio. It was one of our few possessions. It was the brand name was Bush, oddly enough, nothing to do with George, because it worked. But it had a nice wooden cabinet, and you had to have 100 feet of copper wire around the yard to get a signal. And so our entertainment in the evening was to the family would sit around in front of the fireplace, because everything was heated by coal, and listen to the radio. So for a young boy, I got to hear a lot of what was going on, because there's nothing else to listen to. The Prime Minister at the time was Neville Chamberlain, who has since been vilified because of his famous meeting with Adolf Hitler, when he came back with a piece of paper in his hand and said, "Peace in our time." And a few months later, of course, we were at war. But what they forget is that Chamberlain fought in the trenches in World War I. And everybody knows what a dreadful time that was. It was absolutely awful. The kind of stuff that even Ukraine today is not experiencing. So he would go to endless lengths not to go to war again. Well, Hitler, being the kind of guy he was, took advantage of it. Chamberlain believed him. Churchill didn't. I remember Dad arguing about that. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they knew war was coming, because we kids were issued with gas masks before the war started, and you had an identification card. Mine was EDFH 93-7. I don't know why I remember that, but I do. And it was a little cardboard box, like half the size of a shoebox, and a piece of string, and that you wore it to school. You kept it in class on your desk. It was with you all the time. So you had your little box at all times, and then the first time I was evacuated, they was I don't know if the war had broken out or not, but we had a streetcar. We called them trams. The public transportation in my town was not buses. There were some buses, but mostly streetcars, which had the rails set in the center of the street, and tram cars, double deckers, were what the people rode in. And so the meeting place for the families that were going to be evacuated was the tram terminus in Shirley High Street. You can look all these places up, they still exist. So I went to Christchurch with my family, and Dad was working, of course. My mom was allowed to stay for a week, and then we kids lived with their family. And I remember the weird names. The family name was Bacon, and the girls' names were Primula and Aurelia. And I remember those because they're such weird names. But anyway, they were good people. Their intentions were good. Obviously, I was less than happy, but that was the period which is now known as the Phony War. It got so calm. Nothing happened after the fall of France. Nothing happened for a while. And so they sent us all back home. And that's when the you-know-what hit the fan and we were evacuated again. But ration. The other thing that they had, they issued everybody was every family had an air raid shelter. There were two sorts. There was the Anderson shelter, which is what we had, and then there was, I forget the other name, I'll think of it in a minute. If you lived in an apartment or something like that, where you had no yard, they gave you one of these other shelters, which was like a steel box with really sturdy mesh sides, and you crawled into them. People put mattresses on top, made them out of beds. And in retrospect, I thought this is not a very good idea, because there you are in your Morrison. I think it was a Morrison shelter. We'll call it a Morrison shelter for now. If your house is hit and catches fire, you're stuck inside this oven. And in retrospect, that doesn't sound like a very good idea. The Anderson shelter that we had they were really good. And what happened, it was consisted of 3 segments made out of really, really thick corrugated iron, and they were in a half a U shape. And there was a frame that came with it, which you set in the bottom of a hole you dug. And I remember helping my dad to dig the hole, a little boy with his own shovel, and we hit water, because where I lived, it was called Millbrook, and there was a reason for that, because there used to be a brook and a water wheel. So I guess the water had sunk down, and anyway, we hit water, so we had to stop building, and the council came along, lined it with concrete, and then Dad was able to bolt the frame in, and we put the shelter up, which it was enough for 8 people in acute discomfort, but safe. And they were really good shelters, because all the dirt you dug out of the hole, then you banked it on top of the shelter. And people survived with something like a 250-pound bomb, which was a standard size for a medium bomber to carry. And it would land maybe 20 feet away, and they'd survive. They'd blow all the dirt off the shelter, but the people inside would be good. As an interesting after story of those, when the war ended, they didn't know what to do with them. They didn't want them back. What was the government going to do with a couple of million worthless air raid shelters? So they let the people keep them. Well, my dad, being pretty creative and always looking for an easy way of keeping us fed, ended up growing mushrooms in it, and that's a good place to grow mushrooms, in an old air raid shelter. So we lived on mushrooms for a while. I don't know what happened to it. Believe it or not, there are still some. If you ride around and get lucky, you might see some even today. So, going back a little more, Southampton at that time was where the Spitfires were built. The original Spitfire was built at the Supermarine Works, which was on the bank of the River Itchen. Southampton was at the junction of two rivers, the Test and the Itchen, and it formed an estuary, and at about 12 miles out to sea, at the end of the estuary, was the Isle of Wight, which of course is still there. So the Supermarine Company at the time were building the Supermarine Stranraer, which you can look up, Supermarine flying boats, and to get to school, to get from one side of the town to the other, or to get to school, there was a chain ferry. I don't know if you're familiar with chain ferries, but they wind themselves across the water. They don't have a motor. Well, they have a motor, but it winds itself along a cable. And so if you were crossing the river, and of course as a schoolboy I liked it, you could see the seaplanes that they had just built and stuff like that. And if you were really lucky, you'd see one take off. I mean, they weren't very far away. We were only talking a few hundred yards. Biplanes, of course, with the engines between the wings. They also made the Walrus, which is another antique, but served really well during the Battle of Britain. They were a single engine, radial engine, set between the upper and lower wing. I think they had a crew of 3, I'm not sure. But what they would do, they were absolutely no good for front line work, they were so old. But during the Battle of Britain, much of which took place over the English Channel, they would go out and rescue the downed pilots. And they all wore their lifesavers. They were called a Mae West. And I don't know how many of you know who Mae West was, but if you see her, you'll know why they were called Mae Wests. If there were 4 or 5 guys to be picked up, the thing couldn't get airborne. So they'd pile them on board and motor them back to base or back to shore, hanging on wherever they could. And, you know, the English Channel's only 22 miles cross between Calais and Dover, so obviously wider than that. I think from Brighton to Caen is about 80 miles, but you can comfortably tool across on the surface. So that was a great little airplane.
Let's go back to the first night of the bombings.
Oh yeah. Like I said, we didn't hear I didn't hear the sirens go, but I did hear the bombs whistling down. And I remember the name, it was Buck's Garage that got hit. They also hit what was known as a magazine in the UK. A magazine, this was actually in a place called Marchwood, and it's where a lot of, not weapons, ammunition was stored. And they set it on fire, and so from a distance it was pretty spectacular. Lots of bang and lots of what appeared to be rockets. Of course they weren't, they were shells going up, I guess. But anyway, it was a mess. The one thing I do remember, that there was no such thing as supermarkets back then, absolutely unheard of. So there were a lot of mum and pop operations that just had small stores. And on a road, Regent's Park Road, and you can look it up, Regent's Park Road had a little grocery store and what we would call a convenience store today. And in it they had a freezer, which in itself was pretty unusual in England at the time, and they sold ice cream. Well, apart from blowing the shop to pieces, which it did, it blew the freezer out into the middle of the road. And I was looking at it, that's when I found my piece of souvenir shrapnel. And it must have been from a bomb, not a shell, because it was really thick and it was made out of steel. And anti-aircraft shells were not made out of that kind of stuff. Now, that's based on knowledge I have today. I was not that smart as a kid that I would know that.
Do you remember what bombers flew over your
Couldn't
area?
see them. It was nighttime, but they would all be Heinkel 111s and Dornier 17s. That's about all they had. For Germans never had a heavy bomber. Only the United States and Britain had heavy bombers. The German bomber, if you look them up, they're all medium. Towards the end of the war, of course, they tried to get in on it, but it was too late.
Would you guys come out? Did you have your shelter before the bombings?
Yes.
Okay, and
Yeah.
you guys went to, as soon as the bombs started going off that very first night, the war officially started for you at home.
Yes.
And it kind of changed everything, because now it's real.
Yes.
Instead of being away, now it's here.
Yes.
And did the community all come together to help each other out? Did it
Yeah.
make up for a tighter community?
Those that were left behind, there wasn't a lot of that, and the reason there wasn't, for Britain, it was total war. And I'm not denigrating with what America did. Without them, we'd have been sunk, absolutely. But at that time, everything was directed to the war effort. So if you were able-bodied, you had a war job, and if you had a house, like my mother, after we left our first house because of the bombing, we moved to another one in Regent's Park Road, Claremont Road. It's still there, so's the house. We had another air raid shelter, but most of the time the sirens went off before the bombing started, but not always. There was always, in the winter, and I for some reason or other, I remember bitter cold winters. I don't know if it was like that all over, because at that age you don't know anything.
So what happened to your original house before you moved to the second house? What happened to the first house? Was it damaged?
I was not there. My family, well, Mom and Dad were, and I think my brother was, I'm not sure. But a bomb came down. It was an unexploded bomb. It was in the backyard. So they had to get out. And while they were out, there were so many people had bailed out of town that there was no problem finding a house to rent. And back then, I hate to say this, but it's true, England was a very class-conscious country. You know, you were working class, middle class. And in fact, there's a strange thing. I got to look up and see if it's true. And this is a digression, but you might find it interesting. If you had a little business, you got 2 votes in an election, one for your business and one for your house. So my uncle that ended up as mayor of the town, he managed to get 2 votes, I guess. Anyway, but always remember, and I believe it, there's something called the false memory syndrome. And so what I'm telling you is what I remember. If some of it turns out to be factually incorrect, I apologize. But just look it all up.
But just tell your story.
Yeah.
So according to this,
So anyway, yeah,
you had July 10th, 1940 to the 31st of October was during the Battle of
right.
Britain. So
We were on the fringes because if you look at all the Battle of Britain stations, they were all in southeast England, just this side of the eastern side of London, but mostly the eastern side of London and some on the west. So what we got were the strays, or if they got desperate, they would come over. And there's a town called Yeovil, which is way away from where the Battle of Britain took place. But the Germans came after it, just same as they came after another town called Sherborne, which is in the same geographic area. Because Distances, we're so used to it in America that, you go 50 miles, nothing. I come 50 miles to fly a model airplane. Well, that was a big deal. People would actually have different accents that lived only 20 miles away. It's very insular. So Yeovil got bombed, and they got bombed because that was where, and I think they're still there, the Westland Aircraft Company was. They were, among other things, pioneers of flight refueling. And I think that company is still in business. Alan Cobham was the pioneer. Anyway, did see the contrails, did hear it. One time I was not there, but a Spitfire pilot bailed out, and unfortunately his parachute didn't open, and I'm glad I didn't see it looking back. He hit the ground probably 100 yards from where I lived, but I wasn't there at that time, that particular place.
Did you go to school during that time from July to October when the battle was going on, or was school shut down? Or
yes, I did, and it was. Let me see. I got to get my memory straight on this one. 1940. I went to so many schools.
Were schools being bombed and they would just move people around?
Not intentionally, as a waste of stuff. The Germans were brutal, but they weren't stupid. Why would you fly an expensive bomber and a full crew to bomb a school when 2 miles away there's a shipyard? So, yeah, they hit schools. In fact, in Southampton, they hit the Civic Centre, and this was tragic. The safest place was the basement. Unfortunately, the basement was where the boilers were. Cut a long story short, they had a shelter full of kids in it. Anyway, a lot of the civilian casualties were accidental. Due to poor communications, people nowadays don't realize how primitive stuff was. Yeah, you had telephones and stuff, but in relative terms, it was very primitive. So to communicate with fire departments and stuff, if the lines were down, Boy Scouts would run messages. And the Boy Scouts are like teenagers. They're not even military age, they're Boy Scouts. And they would run messages across town during the bombing. Fortunately, I wasn't a Boy Scout. But anyway, that's another little interesting thing that's been forgotten.
What city were you living in when you moved to the second house?
Southampton.
Southampton.
Yeah,
okay.
I lived at the very first house was on Waterhouse Lane, and the house that we moved to, because everybody had bailed out and my mother could move up a notch back to the class society, it was kind of up here. We were down here. Now we had a house in Regent's Park. All right. And it was probably, as the crow flies, maybe a mile and a half away. Not that far, but it was a much nicer area, much nicer house. The original house is what you would call the projects nowadays, except that it wasn't inhabited by less than desirable people. We were just poor. You never need to lock your door. There was only one guy that I know of that owned a car in the whole street, and the street was a good half-mile long.
Wow. Tell me about around the area that you lived at. Were there anti-aircraft guns everywhere, and lights, or what was that like? They were all around, but there were none actually where I lived. But later on in the war, the Brits got really smart, because if somebody shines a searchlight at you,
you know who's shining a searchlight at, you can machine gun down the beam because the ack-ack is not far away from the searchlight. So they would move the searchlights away from the AAA, which they didn't call them AAA back then. They were known as ack-ack. And the other thing we had, I'd forgotten until I was asked to recount my story, is that we had barrage balloons. They were blimps. That's some funny stuff.
How did those work out? Did they ever catch anything?
They weren't supposed to catch anything. They were a deterrent. If you had an effective barrage of balloons, each one attached to a pretty sturdy cable, a mile long, you want to fly lower than a mile? No. So what it did was forced them to higher level bombing. You would be stupid to try dive bombing. And anyway, originally they had these 6-wheeled trucks with a big winch on the back, and they would wind the balloons up and down. Well, England being an island, it gets some hairy weather, and sometimes it would lift the back of with the balloon, it would lift the back of the truck off the ground, and the truck would flip over and the balloon would escape. So they ended up, they would drive a ginormous stake into the ground, run the winch out to, it's just like launching a glider here, and the balloons would go up and down on the winch, but it wasn't over the truck. If it pulled too hard, the truck just ended up against the winch. So
let's talk about you being a kid, and were there areas where you lived at was there anywhere that was bombed and you see in movies or in historical documentaries where the kids are running up and playing on the pile of bricks and running through like dangerous places you'd never have kids now, but during the war it was fun and adventure it looks like for the kids?
I never saw people running around in bombed ruins, but we did some pretty dangerous stuff when I was evacuated. During the time of the Blitz, yeah, you couldn't get near it for rescue people and stuff like that. Now, later on, just before D-Day, when we get to that, yeah, there were some pretty neat places to play.
Yeah.
One of the things, and this is really interesting to me, any store or building that got bombed out and blown away, but it had a basement, they would clear all the rubble away, line the basement and fill it with water, because the biggest threat was fire. The destruction was bad, but when you get fire, it's just like fire here. You get a firestorm, it doesn't care what's in its path, it burns up everything. So water was critical. So they would fill these basements up with water, and the fire department, they didn't call them fire brigade, and they recruited firemen just like you recruit soldiers. They needed lots and lots of firemen, and if you were too old for a soldier, you might end up as a fireman. So they dropped the suction thing and had plenty of water. Later on, and in the heat of an air raid, the chaos and the noise and the smoke, you don't always know where you are. There was no Google Maps or talking telephones that says turn left. You either knew where you were going or you didn't. So to help the firemen, they would paint a big arrow on the side of a wall somewhere, pointing towards the nearest water supply. Now, they're all over town, these big arrows painted on walls, and then they would have SWS, big letters alongside them, which stood for static water supply. Last time I visited England was about 14 years ago, and I thought, I haven't been on the top of a double-decker bus for a long time, so I got on the double-decker bus. Son of a gun, we go past this place on Foundry Lane, and there's an SWS sign still there, and as I thought, I wonder how many people who pass that every day wonder what it is or even think about it. But anyway, it's still there. Well, it was a few years ago.
Did you ever see any German planes that had gotten shot down and crashed?
Nope, never
Nothing?
did.
How about any, was there an airfield that was close to you where you would see Spitfires or Hurricanes or something like that around?
No, not really. I saw him in the air. You weren't encouraged to hang around airfields. Later in the war, when the Americans were there, yeah, I went to P-38s on a place called Way Hill Road. There were plenty of... the local airport is now Southampton Airport. It was called Eastleigh Airport then, because Southampton's one side of it, Eastleigh is the other. Kind of like Visalia and Exeter, put an airfield between them. The Spitfires flew from there. In fact, there was an interesting air raid there. I'd forgotten that. The Bristol Blenheim, at a quick glance, like in cloudy weather or miserable weather, Bristol Blenheim and Ju-88 can be mistaken, and the Germans knew that, and they wanted to bomb the Spitfire builder's place. Well, it wasn't called Supermarine at that time because they didn't own it. It was owned by a company called Cunliffe Owen, and they're interesting people to look up. They built flying wings and stuff, tried to make a commercial airliner after the war. It didn't work very well. But anyway, they decided that would be a good place to bomb because they were making Spitfires and Spitfire parts. And so a squadron of Blenheims were apparently returning from an operation, and the Ju-88s followed them in, and everybody on the ground thought they were all Blenheims, and then they found out they weren't when they bomb doors opened and they did their best to bomb the Cunliffe Owen factory. I wasn't there, I didn't see it, my dad did. I don't know what the results of the bombing were, but you know, we have a tendency, and there's nothing wrong with it. We have our heroes, you know, the RAF, the USAF, the French Air Force, but we forget the Germans had their heroes too, and not every German was a Nazi. And my dad was working at Thornycroft. Thornycroft was a shipbuilding yard just upriver from the Supermarine Works, and they built smaller things like destroyer escorts. They did not build big warships, but they would build up to a destroyer size. Well, it was a cloudy day, and Dad did see this. He came home and told us. There was a ship moored there, a destroyer undergoing repairs, and without any warning, a German bomber, he didn't know what it was, appeared out of the clouds, made a pass over the ship, wasn't satisfied with it, went back up through the clouds. Now, while he's passing over the ship, not only are all the town's guns firing at him, but the guns on the ship are firing at him. So he must have turned around above the clouds, because next time he came in below the clouds, made another bombing run over the ship, still wasn't satisfied, everybody's shooting at him, goes back up through the clouds. Third time he did it, came back through the clouds, made a bombing, dropped 3 bombs, one hit the stern, one amidships, and one hit the bow of the ship, and he sailed back up through the clouds and gone. Now see, if he'd been a Brit or an American, we'd have given him a big medal for that, but he was the enemy, so rah, rah, rah.
And what type of ship was it?
It was a destroyer.
Oh, okay.
It was either a destroyer or the next size down. It wasn't a big ship.
And this is whenever the bombers and Stukas were coming across the English Channel and bombing the ships.
Oh yeah,
right out through there.
Anything along the south coast was fair game, because that's where the easiest places to get to are. And if you go further east, you got to cross the North Sea. Now they did, of course. In fact, if you go back to, people forget air raid bombings are not of civilian populations overseas. It's not a new phenomenon. In World War I, the Zeppelins used to come across the North Sea and bomb the east coast of England. They lost several thousand people, but you never hear about that. And that's understandable. There's so much history. But they would fly at an altitude, well, they're not flying, they're floating. They would float at an altitude that could not be reached by the fighters of the day. And the first Zeppelin to be shot down was not by the Royal Flying Corps, but by the rival. It was the Royal Naval Air Service. And I think he was flying a Sopwith triplane, but I'm not sure. Now I diverged, I'm sorry.
When London was bombed, and whenever they sent bombers over and bombed Germany, was that in the newspapers? Was that a big deal to rile up for everyone? Tell me about that.
Deal. The very first 1,000 bomber raid. I'm fortunate in that in the early days of the war, I actually heard Churchill on our famous Bush radio, because we would sit around it, and I heard his speech, his famous speech about we'll fight them on the beaches and all that stuff. I did hear that. Yeah, there was no clear-cut division. The most memorable thing I saw was during the night bombing and after the worst of it was over. This is ridiculous. They used to allow us to come home for weekends, which I didn't. You don't even think about things like that when you're a kid. But looking back on it, why would they let us come home weekends? The Germans are going to stop bombing?
So for clarity, this is whenever they took all the children out of like the cities and sent them out to the countryside during the week.
Yeah.
And then on the weekend, they got to come home.
Towards the end of the war, they brought us home. This is crazy.
Oh, okay. That's something I never knew.
Yeah. I used to come home weekends on the train.
So tell me, where was it that they would send you to as a kid?
First place I went to was Christchurch. Now, you look at a map, you think that's ridiculous. That's only 20 miles from Southampton. Well, yeah, it's a small town. The next place I went to, you'll be hard pressed to find it on the map, but it's there. It was called Henstridge, and that was the only time I remember being really unhappy, miserably unhappy. It was so primitive. The master of the house was a drunk. He was the village carpenter. There was a floor. First of all, the building was about 300 years old. It had a thatched roof, thick thatched roof. It had a stone floor, but was just flagstones laid straight on the dirt. It had an outdoor privy, and there was no plumbing and no electricity and no gas. So the plumbing in the house consisted of you're familiar with these pumps where you pump the handle, except it was inside the house. The privy was typical, and they used those, I think they're still in business, Primus, the Swedish companies, kerosene powered cooking things you pump up, and that supplemented a coal fired range, which was, anyway, I was very unhappy there. So there was thousands of children all spread out everywhere throughout, but this is your story. Some were sent to the United States. Some went to Canada, some to the United States, some were sent to Australia. I mean, it sounds weird now, but especially when it took 3 weeks by ship to get there. You didn't fly anywhere. Some of the guys I went to school with later, when I went to a better educational level, one of them had been evacuated to the United States. miserable thing I have about an air raid was when they had these sporadic raids and the German came over, got caught in the searchlights. And you know, German aircraft are flat camouflage just like everybody else's, olive drab on top, grey underneath. When you get 7 searchlights, they look like they're silver. And then they're twisting and turning, trying to get out. You can't get out of it. You can't get out of it. You just can't escape. Now, of course, searchlights are out of date. So anyway, that was that one.
And you got to see that?
Yeah, saw the tracers going up and everything.
Towards the end of the Battle of Britain, is there anything you'd like to add about, like, stories or anything like that about?
Yeah, there is one. There's always a connection. There's a connection to today's politics, believe it or not. Trump's golf course is in Turnberry, Scotland. Turnberry, Scotland, in the World War I, was a training airfield for the Royal Flying Corps. My mother drove a Crosley ambulance at that field, picking up bodies from crashed airplanes. Then in World War II, she was an air raid warden. She also, the Spitfire was a good airplane, but if you look at one, if you get hit in the nose, the pilot's going to get burnt with gasoline or oil. And had terrible burns, Spitfire pilots up by the gross. And it was in the pioneering days of plastic surgery, and one of the famous surgeons was Sir Archibald Mackindo, and they called themselves Mackindo guinea pigs. And some of them were so burnt they couldn't read or write. And my mother was used to seeing, you know, bad stuff from war, so she also would go and read the letters from home to the fighter pilots that were there. And write the letters back home for them. So
that's that story?
She did her share.
Do you have any stories about the buzz bombs or the V2s?
Not a lot, because their primary target was London. The early V1, the Germans were so far ahead of everybody else. They weren't radio controlled. They were pre-planned with a fuel cut-off and a gyro, and they launched them and off they went. So, not surprisingly, they occasionally would go astray. And the only one I've seen 2, one in the sky and one on the ground, that had been shot down or something. It was in one piece and burning, and the fire department were spraying it. The other one was nighttime, and all I saw was a glow. But the one thing I remember, they just sounded like a 2-stroke motorcycle engine. That's what they sounded like. And when that cut out, that's when you knew they were going to go down. That's when they just nosedived. Never saw a plane chasing one. Never saw a Spitfire pursuing one, or better yet, a Tempest. But that's it.
Do you remember the buildup of Americans, and when the Americans came over and started building bases and B-17s?
Oh, yeah.
Can you tell me about what that time was like, and if you got to meet some American boys over there?
The American arrival for children. The one thing I remember about American soldiers, one good, one bad, but 99.9% good. They were so good to us kids. They knew we'd been basically starved for 3 years, you know, when Britain was on its own. Food was in acute short supply, and there was a army barracks called Blymont Barracks. The building is still there. I don't know what it is now, but it was on Millbrook Road, which wasn't that far from my home. One of the things that happened during, one of the many things, towards the end of the war, which would be the last year and a half, shall we say, if you had spare rooms in your house, the government could billet anybody they wanted to there. And for a while we had 3 war workers billeted with us. And then we had some Navy guys that were on the motor torpedo boats. So they were based in Southampton to fight the E-boats in the English Channel. And for some unaccountable reason, I remember one of them was named Dave. But since all the guys of military age in Britain were in the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, they were off somewhere, there was an acute shortage of males. So when the GIs came over, being normal human beings of appropriate age, first they want to find us a girlfriend. So we had 3 young ladies, war workers, and one of them started dating this American. His name was Marvin. Marvin used to come visit the house. That's another story. I'll get to that later. But no, it was Marvin. Anyway, they had taken over the Plymouth barracks, and he took me as a kid down to the barracks one day. And it was all legal. I mean, it wasn't breaking any rules or anything. And fed me. And there was stuff I hadn't seen for years, stuff I'd never seen. My first introduction to a genuine hot dog was funny. I thought it was a sausage. And I bit this thing, I couldn't stand it. But then he said, "You want some ice cream?" I forget what he called me. It wasn't Ralph. He had a name for me. "Do you want some ice cream?" I said, "Yeah, I'd like some ice cream, thank you." So he goes out to wherever they got it, came back. I'd never seen so much ice cream in my life. It's like a bucket, and I could have as much as I wanted. I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. And then they'd meet kids in the streets, they'd hand them out chewing gum. They were really, really good to kids. That's one thing I do remember. The other thing is, they all looked immaculately turned out, because we had Air Force people, well, Army Air Corps. We had, there were 3 air bases around Andover.
What planes?
B-17s and B-24s. I did see a lot of those. So the crew, you know, Gregory Peck in the movie 12 O'Clock High, they really looked like that to me in my memory. Their uniforms were immaculate. They got gabardine, British military uniforms, looked like horse blankets dyed khaki and stitched more or less to make a uniform. Britain was poor. The British soldiers got a few dollars a day, relatively speaking. And it caused a lot of jealousy because each country didn't really understand the other. You know, I don't know how many go to a bar. It used to be when I had to learn the customs when I came over here. There's 4 or 5 of you sitting at the bar, and you buy a round of drinks, and they put the change. You just leave the change there if you're going to stay for a while. And they'd come, and when you bought another round, they'd take the money. And I learned that. Well, you didn't do that in the UK. That would be showing off. So the Americans would do what they normally do, and it caused some resentment until it was pointed out, no, this is what they do. You know, they're not showing off. I never saw an American what I would call showing off. Now, I'm sure there were some, because there were millions of them, but the place, you couldn't go anywhere. Britain, England, the southern part of England is a pretty small area. That's where they were, because that's where the invasion was launched from. So you'd have a couple of million Americans enter an area about a heck of a lot small, about the size of Southern California. Not very big. So you couldn't go anywhere without seeing Americans. And I only have good memories of Americans. But the first time their equipment fascinated me, being a boy. Am I going on too long?
No, go ahead.
I was coming home from school, and I told you earlier there was a P-38 base on Way Hill Road, it's called, outside Andover. So I saw this funny little vehicle coming down the Way Hill Road with 4 giants in it, wearing American uniforms. With my buddy, look, what's that? Well, it was a Jeep with 4 American Air Force people in it. And holy cow, these are big guys for a small vehicle. I didn't think that at the time. But they just look, I remember so. And they seemed to be too big for the vehicle. Four big guys in a Willys World War II Jeep take up a lot of room. So that was that. But I always remember them. They must have got terribly bored between operations, wandering around Andover. I was in Andover. That was one of my evacuation places, and I had a good billet there, good foster home. They just seemed like, I liked them. The kids liked them, and I was a kid. I didn't see any naval personnel until just before D-Day. They didn't seem to come ashore, but GIs and Air Force by the million. So, yeah, good impression.
Tell me about victory in Europe. When do you remember where you were and what happened when you found out that the war was over?
I do not remember the specific time I found out, which is really odd. I remember the first atomic bomb, which isn't odd. I was older then, of course. What I do remember is street parties. Street parties, people in the streets dancing, music going, what food they could scrounge up together was out for everybody. Block off both ends of the street you want to drive through, too bad, we're having a party. Yeah, VE Day parties were everywhere. The actual time the surrender was announced, no, I don't remember it. Isn't that odd? It's very strange, but I don't remember the actual announcement.
I could just imagine the weight off of your shoulders and everyone living through that, going from the bombings and going through everything, and then having the Americans there, and then through D-Day, and then now finally the war is over and you feel like you can rebuild possibly and get back to your life, or make it to whatever life you wanted, but just the whole that weight on your shoulders over.
Well, this sounds really awful, and I remember I'm a teenager now. Teenagers are different, as you know. I remember beginning a few days after that, feeling completely flat. I do remember this. No excitement, everything was dull, no dramatic news. I mean, a 15-year-old boy doesn't give a shit about a peace treaty and stuff like that. He's interested in the technology, the bombs, the planes, all that stuff. I remember feeling very flat. It's like the day after a really good party. That's how I felt. Isn't that strange? But that's how I felt. I clearly remember that. And it took me a long time to get used to it. But I felt a little bit the same as that after I came out of the RAF, so not unusual. But I do remember the relief on my mother and father. They had to, you don't think about this, they had to have been worried out of their minds. With bombing going on, their kids are away, no communication. no telephone. She couldn't phone me up or ask me how I was doing, so she would visit us once a month sometimes to see how we were doing. I can't imagine what it was like for the parents of the kids. You know, the kids knew they were okay, but the parents didn't. So anyway, that was that.
Is there anything you'd like to add to the end before we go?
Yeah, I really wish people today would have an attitude towards each other that people had back then. A good illustration would be, as bad as it was, when Italy surrendered, and Italian prisoners of war, before Italy surrendered, Italian prisoners of war were brought to England. They gave them a set of coveralls and a big brown patch on the back. They weren't even incarcerated. They were looked after. They worked the fields and the farms under supervision. But people would talk to them. People did not hate the Italians. I'm sure some people did. There's always a hater. Germans were a different kettle of fish. I was going to school one day, and there was a railroad crossing, and it was shut. The gates came down. It was a trainload of German prisoners of war, and even as a youth, I didn't feel a lot for them. You know, if somebody said, "You can pull that handle and kill all those guys," I'd have probably pulled the handle. Looking back, what an insane attitude. Not every German was a Nazi. He's just doing what he's told in the Wehrmacht or the Air Force. So, hindsight's always 20/20. I don't hate anybody now.
Well, thanks for sharing your story with us, and thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.